"Do not trust the DNA report." The words slipped out so softly that for a second they almost disappeared into the polished silence of the Carter Genetics boardroom. Yet they landed with the weight of a braking system, and every head in the room turned toward the small figure standing near the glass table where billion-dollar decisions were usually made. Maya Johnson, barely old enough to reach the height of the table edge, stood still with her hands pressed together as if holding something invisible but unbreakable. Her eyes locked on Ethan Carter, the billionaire founder whose entire empire was built on the promise of precision and truth in genetic science. Ethan froze mid-motion, a leather folder still half open in his hand, the official DNA report inside stamped with corporate seals and legal confirmations that had just been presented as final, absolute, unquestionable truth. Around him, executives exchanged uneasy glances, and Victoria Carter, his wife, sat perfectly composed at the far end of the table, her posture elegant, her expression carefully neutral, though her fingers tightened slightly around her phone as if anchoring herself to control. Ethan slowly turned his head toward the child, his voice low and controlled but edged with confusion as he asked what she meant, and Maya did not flinch, did not lower her gaze. Instead, she took a small step forward and repeated it with quiet certainty. "Your wife changed the DNA report." The room seemed to lose its air in that instant, the hum of the ventilation system suddenly louder, the distant city beyond the glass walls fading into an abstract blur, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, not anger yet, but a fracture in certainty. Victoria let out a soft, almost amused breath and finally spoke, her tone measured, almost gentle, as she said the child was confused, that people sometimes misunderstood technical documents, that emotions could distort perception, but her eyes never fully met Maya's. Ethan glanced down at the report again, the thick stack of printed data showing genetic markers, probabilities, and confirmation statements that had been signed off by the lab director himself, Dr. Alan Reed, whose name carried weight across the entire industry. Yet Maya stepped closer, reaching into her worn backpack and pulling out a thin folder that looked out of place in the pristine environment, its edges slightly bent, its surface marked by what looked like hurried handling, and she placed it carefully on the table without a word. Ethan hesitated before opening it, his fingers slow, almost reluctant, as though touching it might alter reality itself, and when he did, his eyes flicked across a different version of the same DNA report, one that looked identical at first glance, but carried subtle discrepancies in timestamps, authorization codes, and digital signatures that did not align with the official version in his hand. A faint silence spread through the room as Ethan compared the documents side by side, the executive team leaning forward slightly, sensing the shift but not yet understanding its full weight, while Victoria's composure tightened by a fraction, her jaw setting almost imperceptibly. Maya's voice broke the silence again, still soft but steady, explaining that she had seen the lab access logs, that she had watched the system records change at an unusual hour, and that the edits were not part of standard correction protocol. And as she spoke, Ethan's attention sharpened, his analytical mind catching patterns even before emotional acceptance could form. He looked toward Victoria, searching her face for reassurance, but found only calm distance, and in that absence of connection something deeper unsettled him. The room's temperature felt unchanged, yet everything inside it seemed to shift, as if the foundation of what he believed about his own life was quietly being lifted. Ethan closed the folder slowly, then reopened the official report again, scanning it line by line, and for the first time noticing inconsistencies he had overlooked in his trust of the system he himself had built. Maya did not interrupt him now. She simply stood there, small but unwavering, like a point of truth that refused to move regardless of pressure around it. Victoria finally spoke again, softer this time, suggesting they move this conversation away from the boardroom, that such matters were sensitive, that a child should not be involved in corporate or personal disputes of this magnitude. But Ethan raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to pause everything, his mind now fully engaged in a way that made the room feel distant. He asked Maya one question, carefully, almost cautiously, where she had gotten the second report, and she replied that it came from inside the system itself, from a restricted access log that should not have been visible unless someone had already been inside, altering what others were meant to trust as final. That was when Ethan Carter realized the problem was no longer just about a document, or a lab result, or even a misunderstanding, but about the integrity of everything he had built. And as he looked once more at his wife sitting perfectly still across from him, he understood for the first time that some truths do not arrive loudly. They arrive in whispers that quietly divide everything into before and after. The silence in the boardroom did not break immediately. It stretched, fragile and heavy, as Ethan Carter slowly lowered both documents onto the table, as if even the act of releasing them might cause something irreversible to happen. Maya Johnson remained still where she stood, her small hands now resting at her sides, watching him with a calm that did not match her age, while Victoria Carter finally rose from her chair with measured elegance, smoothing her sleeves as though nothing unusual had occurred. She walked a few steps closer, stopping just short of the table, and spoke in a voice that was controlled but firm, stating again that the child was mistaken, that the laboratory system was secure, that no alteration could occur without multiple layers of authorization, and that Ethan knew better than anyone how tightly controlled their genetic verification protocols were. Around them, the executives shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty to the company founder and the social weight of his marriage, while Ethan remained silent, his eyes moving between the two versions of the report as if searching for a version of reality that felt stable again. Maya finally spoke, not loudly, but clearly, explaining that she had not guessed anything, that she had followed digital access trails left behind in the audit logs, and that the modification timestamps did not align with any official correction procedure. But Victoria immediately interrupted her, gently but sharply, saying that children often misinterpreted technical data they did not fully understand, especially when exposed to confidential material without context. Ethan lifted one hand slightly, signaling for calm, and asked Maya where she had seen the system logs, and she replied that she had accessed a secondary observation terminal in the lab archives after noticing discrepancies between printed and digital versions of the report, which caused a subtle shift in the room as one of the executives exchanged a glance with another, realizing the seriousness of what she was describing. Victoria turned toward Ethan now, her voice softening as she addressed him directly, reminding him of the history they shared, of the trust they had built, of the fact that their company had never once suffered a breach of integrity at this level, and she suggested that bringing a child into this discussion risked turning a procedural matter into an emotional misunderstanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers along the edge of the table, his mind caught between analytical instinct and emotional hesitation, because the data in front of him was precise enough to demand attention. Yet the implications of accepting it would destabilize not only his marriage, but the entire framework of trust within his own company. Maya took a small step forward again, placing her backpack on the chair beside her, and added quietly that she had also found a pattern in the access logs indicating that the modification occurred during a narrow window when only a limited number of users had system clearance, and she named the time without hesitation, a late-night hour that caused one of the executives to look down at his tablet instinctively. Victoria's expression changed only slightly, a brief flicker of irritation crossing her face before she composed herself again, and she insisted that this was precisely why. Children should not be exposed to partial information, because isolated data points could easily form incorrect conclusions when not interpreted by professionals. Ethan finally looked directly at Victoria, studying her face as if seeing it through a different lens, then asked her calmly if she had any reason to believe the report had been altered in any way, and she met his gaze without hesitation and said no, that the report had been processed through standard channels, verified by Dr. Alan Reed, and sealed according to protocol. As if summoned by the name, the conference room door opened and Dr. Alan Reed entered, adjusting his glasses and immediately sensing the tension in the air, and Ethan asked him directly to confirm the integrity of the report sequence. Dr. Reed hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stating that all procedures had been followed correctly, that the final report had been validated, and that no irregularities had been flagged in the system alerts at the time of processing. Maya did not react outwardly, but her eyes shifted slightly toward Ethan, as if waiting for him to notice what was not being said rather than what was. Ethan thanked Dr. Reed and asked him to remain available, then sat back slightly, exhaling again as though trying to reset his thoughts, while Victoria placed a gentle hand on the back of her chair and suggested that they move forward with scheduled agenda items, because corporate time could not be consumed indefinitely by what she called speculative confusion. But Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the two reports again, and for the first time, he noticed the absence of something he had always taken for granted, a consistent digital fingerprint that should have been identical across both versions, but was subtly different in ways that only became visible under direct comparison. Maya quietly added that she had preserved the original checksum data before the alteration, and she offered it without emotion, placing another printed sheet beside the others. Victoria's composure tightened once more, though her voice remained steady as she repeated that this entire situation was being overcomplicated, and that emotional interpretation was interfering with rational evaluation. Ethan raised his eyes slowly from the table to her, then to Maya, and then back to the documents. And in that sequence, something in him shifted, not into conclusion, but into uncertainty that demanded investigation rather than assumption. He finally spoke again, stating that nothing would proceed further until an independent review of all system logs and genetic data records had been completed, and that access to the entire lab database was to be temporarily restricted pending audit. The room reacted with subtle tension at that decision, because it was not procedural language but personal authority being asserted, and Victoria went still for a moment before asking him quietly if he truly intended to escalate this based on the words of a child, and Ethan replied that he intended to verify the truth regardless of its source, because the integrity of their entire system depended on it. Maya lowered her gaze slightly for the first time, not in defeat but in relief, while Victoria looked at Ethan with a controlled expression that no longer carried softness, only calculation, as the atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion into something far more fragile, the beginning of a fracture that could no longer be contained by silence alone. The request for a full system audit was already in motion, but the atmosphere inside Carter Genetics had changed in a way that no protocol could fully contain, as Ethan Carter remained seated at the head of the glass table, staring at the layered reports in front of him, as if they had transformed from static documents into something far more unstable, while Victoria Carter stood near the window with her arms loosely folded, her posture calm but no longer inviting, and Maya Johnson remained quietly at the side of the room, her presence small in scale but increasingly central in influence. The executives had begun leaving one by one after Ethan issued the audit directive, each step out of the room feeling heavier than the last, until only the core group remained under the cold, even lighting of the boardroom. Dr. Alan Reed had been instructed to stay, and he now stood near the edge of the table reviewing system notes on a tablet, his expression controlled but subtly tense as he scrolled through internal logs that were being reopened in real time by Ethan's authorization override. Maya broke the silence first, explaining that she had cross-checked the checksum identifiers between the printed genetic report and the archived digital file, and that the mismatch did not appear random, but followed a pattern consistent with intentional recalibration of data fields after initial validation. Though she used simpler language than the lab terminology she had clearly studied. Dr. Reed looked up briefly at her explanation, then returned to his screen, while Victoria finally turned away from the window and walked back toward the table, her voice calm as she asked Ethan if he truly intended to continue escalating what she still framed as a misunderstanding, emphasizing the risk to public confidence in their company if internal disputes became visible. Ethan did not answer immediately, because he was reading something new that had appeared in the audit feed, a secondary access record showing a login to the genetics database during a restricted time window that matched the period Maya had described earlier, and the credentials tied to that access were partially masked but still traceable to an internal administrative profile. He asked Dr. Reed to confirm whether that profile belonged to any active technician, and Dr. Reed hesitated before stating that it was associated with a legacy account that should have been disabled after a departmental restructuring, though the system had retained partial privileges due to an incomplete decommissioning process. Maya quietly stepped closer to the table and pointed to a line in the metadata indicating that the access event included not only viewing permissions, but also modification rights applied directly to the DNA report file structure, And as she spoke, Ethan felt the shape of the situation begin to shift from theoretical possibility into structured evidence. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her voice tightened slightly as she insisted that legacy accounts were common in large systems and that unauthorized assumptions should not be made without confirming intent. But Ethan interrupted her gently, stating that intent was not yet the question, because the first priority was establishing whether the data had been altered at all. At that moment, Dr. Reed's tablet emitted a soft alert indicating that the audit system had finished reconstructing a partial version of the original file history, and he turned the screen toward Ethan, revealing a sequence of changes that showed the DNA report undergoing a recalibration event after initial certification, a process that should not have occurred without formal reauthorization. The room seemed to contract around that information, not physically but perceptually, as Ethan leaned forward and studied the timeline, noticing that the modification event was followed by a second verification stamp that appeared legitimate but carried subtle inconsistencies in encryption signature alignment. Maya confirmed softly that this was the exact pattern she had identified, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her voice, only quiet certainty grounded in observation. Victoria stepped closer to the table and looked down at the same timeline, her eyes scanning rapidly, and she stated that even if anomalies existed, they did not automatically imply intentional manipulation, because system errors or synchronization conflicts could produce similar artifacts in complex databases. Ethan finally stood up from his chair, placing both hands on the table as he leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the reconstructed log, and he said in a controlled voice that regardless of cause, the integrity of the report that had been presented to him as final was now in question, which meant every conclusion drawn from it was also in question. He turned toward Dr. Reed and asked for a full rollback simulation to reconstruct the dataset prior to any modification events, and Dr. Reed nodded slowly before initiating the process on his device, which triggered a real-time visualization of data states shifting across the screen. Maya watched the reconstruction carefully, her attention focused on a specific timestamp, and she pointed out that at one point during the rollback sequence, an external synchronization request had been approved through an administrative override that did not match any of the standard approval hierarchies, a detail that caused Dr. Reed to pause and zoom in on the log entry. Victoria's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table as she asked who had the authority to initiate such an override, and Dr. Reed responded that it would require either top-level executive clearance or direct access to the system through a master administrative token. A brief silence followed that statement, longer than the ones before it, because it introduced a structural implication that could not be easily dismissed as error or misunderstanding. Ethan slowly looked up from the screen and toward Victoria, not with accusation, but with a new level of attention that changed the tone of the room entirely. While Maya remained still, her role in the moment no longer as a child presenting information, but as the one who had forced a system to reveal what it had been designed to hide. The reconstructed system timeline remained open on Dr. Alan Reed's screen, casting a pale blue glow across the boardroom as Ethan Carter stood motionless in front of it, his hands no longer resting on the table, but hanging slightly at his sides as if he had forgotten their weight. While Victoria Carter remained near the center of the room, her posture unchanged but her attention now fully focused on the evolving data stream. And Maya Johnson stood quietly beside the chair she had occupied earlier, watching not the people anymore but the sequence of digital events unfolding as though she had already seen what others were only beginning to understand. The screen displayed the administrative override event again, highlighting the precise moment the DNA report file had been accessed outside normal protocol, and Dr. Reed confirmed in a controlled voice that the override had bypassed standard verification layers, requiring either direct executive authentication or possession of a master encryption token that should be restricted to a very small number of individuals within the organization. Ethan finally spoke, asking for clarification on every account that held such access during the recorded window, and Dr. Reed began listing them slowly, including Ethan himself, 2 senior board members, and Victoria Carter, whose name entered the conversation with a weight that subtly changed the temperature of the room even though nothing physical had shifted. Victoria turned her head slightly toward Dr. Reed, her expression still composed, and she stated calmly that access capability did not imply usage, and that the presence of credentials in a system was not equivalent to action, emphasizing that large-scale enterprise networks often required multiple overlapping permissions for operational continuity. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the log sequence, where the override event had been followed by a modification signature that matched the timing Maya had originally identified, and he asked Dr. Reed to isolate the exact source terminal of the access request. Dr. Reed hesitated briefly before initiating a deeper trace, and the room fell into a tighter silence as the system began reconstructing network origin points, each line of data appearing incrementally on the screen. Maya stepped slightly closer, pointing at a segment of the trace that indicated a secure internal connection routed through a private administrative network node, and she explained in careful terms that this type of routing typically bypassed external monitoring systems, which meant the action was likely performed from within a controlled environment rather than an external breach. Victoria's eyes followed the highlighted path on the screen, and for the first time her composure showed a faint disruption, not emotional collapse, but a subtle recalibration of focus, as she stated again that internal routing could still be triggered accidentally through automated maintenance scripts or scheduled system diagnostics. Ethan raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt her, but to pause the discussion, and he asked Dr. Reed if any maintenance operations had been scheduled during that exact time window, to which Dr. Reed replied that none had been authorized and that the system logs showed the override as a manual execution event rather than an automated process. A heavier silence followed this confirmation, and Maya quietly added that the modification pattern did not match error correction behavior, but instead showed deliberate sequential edits applied across multiple data fields in a structured order, suggesting intent rather than malfunction. Ethan exhaled slowly, then asked for the authentication signature attached to the override, and Dr. Reed expanded the log detail further, revealing an encrypted identifier that partially resolved into a recognizable internal access profile format, though the final characters remained masked due to security protocols. Victoria stepped closer to the table and studied the identifier without speaking for several seconds, then stated that even if an internal profile was involved, it still did not establish responsibility, because credentials could be compromised or temporarily reassigned during high-level operational events. Ethan finally turned toward her fully, his expression no longer uncertain, but focused in a way that indicated he was evaluating not just the data, but the consistency of explanations surrounding it, and he asked directly whether she had any reason to believe her own credentials had ever been used outside her knowledge during recent system operations. Victoria met his gaze and answered without hesitation that she had not authorized any such access, and that her credentials were secured under multi-factor authentication protocols that required physical device confirmation. Dr. Reed then announced that the system had completed a deeper forensic reconstruction, and the screen updated again, revealing a secondary confirmation layer applied immediately after the modification event, which appeared to validate the altered DNA report as final despite the inconsistencies now being exposed. Maya observed this carefully and noted that the validation signature did not originate from the same terminal as the modification event, indicating a separation between the alteration process and its final approval stamp, which suggested coordination between multiple access points. Ethan placed both hands lightly on the edge of the table again, leaning forward as he processed the implication that the system had not only been altered but also deliberately finalized in a way designed to appear legitimate under standard review conditions. Victoria stated that such multi-point validation could occur in complex enterprise systems when redundancy protocols intersected with delayed synchronization, but her voice carried a slight change in tone that was no longer purely explanatory. Ethan then asked Dr. Reed to run a cross-comparison between the validation signature and all historical approval patterns within the company's genetic verification division, and Dr. Reed complied, triggering another sequence of analysis that populated the screen with comparative data lines. As the results appeared, Maya pointed out one specific alignment pattern that matched a previously decommissioned authorization route associated with legacy administrative access, the same category of system entry Dr. Reed had referenced earlier as partially disabled but not fully purged from the infrastructure. The room remained silent as this connection became visible to everyone simultaneously, and Ethan slowly looked from the screen back to Victoria, not speaking yet, but allowing the implication of the data to settle fully into the space between them, where trust, procedure, and uncertainty were no longer separate concepts, but overlapping layers of the same unfolding truth. The reconstructed verification stream on the screen shifted again, now highlighting a narrowed set of internal access routes, while the atmosphere inside the boardroom of Carter Genetics had become markedly heavier, not because of any external disruption, but because of the internal realization that every layer of assumed security was now being re-examined in real time. Ethan Carter stood still at the edge of the table, his attention fixed on the cascading logs as Dr. Alan Reed adjusted the display to isolate the legacy authorization pathway that had been flagged in the previous analysis, and Victoria Carter remained positioned slightly away from the group, her expression controlled but no longer fully neutral, as if she was calculating each word before it left her. Maya Johnson, however, had shifted her focus from the screen to Ethan, watching not for reaction but for decision, as if the moment of interpretation mattered more than the data itself. Dr. Reed explained that the legacy authorization route identified in the system was part of an older infrastructure layer that had been preserved during corporate scaling transitions, meaning it retained limited functionality under emergency redundancy conditions. But in practice, it should not have been capable of executing sensitive modifications without triggering multiple alerts across independent monitoring systems. Ethan asked quietly whether any alerts had been triggered during the original modification window, and Dr. Reed confirmed that the system logs showed no recorded escalation events, which created a contradiction that immediately tightened the already fragile balance in the room. Victoria stepped forward slightly and stated that the absence of alerts could indicate a logging synchronization delay rather than intentional concealment, emphasizing that distributed systems sometimes experience propagation gaps during high-traffic processing cycles, especially when multiple verification layers operate simultaneously. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he moved his gaze back to the timeline reconstruction, where the modification event, the validation signature, and the legacy authorization trace were all now displayed in sequence, forming a pattern that suggested coordination rather than randomness, even if each individual component still had plausible technical explanations. Maya quietly pointed out that the timing between the modification and the validation was unusually short, indicating that whoever approved the final report had done so within seconds of the data alteration, a detail that reduced the likelihood of independent verification and increased the possibility of prior awareness. Dr. Reed acknowledged the observation but added that internal system efficiency could allow rapid processing under pre-approved conditions, though his tone suggested that even he recognized the narrowing space for procedural ambiguity. Ethan finally straightened slightly and asked for a full trace of physical access points associated with the legacy authorization route, including any administrative terminals that could have been used to initiate the override sequence, and Dr. Reed began executing the command, bringing up a geographic and network mapping of internal access nodes across the corporate campus. As the map expanded on the screen, several access points illuminated briefly, and then narrowed to a small cluster of secure offices within the executive wing, which caused a subtle shift in the room's energy as everyone present understood the significance of proximity in controlled environments. Victoria's expression tightened slightly as she observed the highlighted cluster, and she stated calmly that executive access zones were shared spaces designed for operational efficiency, not restricted personal environments, reinforcing the idea that physical location alone could not determine responsibility. Ethan acknowledged her point, but did not take his eyes off the display, where one specific terminal showed a correlation between the access event timestamp and a logged entry from a device registered under executive authentication credentials. Maya stepped closer again, indicating the specific node, and explained that the system recorded not only access but also session duration and command execution depth, both of which suggested active engagement with the report rather than passive viewing. Dr. Reed confirmed that the session had included multiple modification commands, not just a single approval action, which implied a deliberate sequence of edits rather than a one-time authorization anomaly. A quiet tension spread through the room as Ethan absorbed this information, because the structure of the data no longer supported isolated error theory without requiring multiple coincidental failures across independent safeguards. Victoria spoke again, her tone now slightly more firm, stating that even if a pattern existed, correlation did not equal causation, and that drawing conclusions at this stage risked misinterpreting complex system behavior under incomplete reconstruction. Ethan finally turned toward her fully and asked in a measured voice whether she was suggesting that multiple independent system logs, validation sequences, and access traces were all simultaneously malfunctioning in a coordinated manner, and the question hung in the air without immediate response. Dr. Reed intervened carefully, stating that statistically, such multi-layer synchronization failure would be highly improbable without an external guiding factor or internal override sequence executed with precise knowledge of system architecture. Maya remained silent during this exchange, but her presence anchored the focus of the room, because she was no longer presenting isolated evidence, but a connected structure that forced all participants to interpret the same reality from different positions of certainty. Ethan slowly exhaled and asked for one final confirmation, whether the legacy authorization pathway had ever been documented as being used successfully in any recent operational audit, and Dr. Reed replied that it had not, at least not in any approved capacity, and that its presence in the current chain of events represented a deviation from all recorded procedural norms. At that moment, Ethan stepped slightly back from the table, not in retreat but in recalibration, as the full weight of the reconstructed system data settled into a conclusion that was still unspoken but increasingly difficult to ignore. While Victoria stood still, watching him carefully, and Maya remained quiet, as the room entered a state where the question was no longer what had happened, but who had the capacity and opportunity to make it happen within a system built specifically to prevent it. The silence that followed the final system confirmation did not feel empty, but instead felt compressed, as if the entire boardroom at Carter Genetics had been sealed inside a single unresolved moment. While Ethan Carter stood near the edge of the glass table, with his eyes fixed on the reconstructed access map that still glowed faintly on the screen, and Dr. Alan Reed remained frozen in place, his hands resting near the tablet but no longer actively interacting with it, as though any further input might alter something already too sensitive to touch. Victoria Carter broke the silence first, stepping forward with deliberate calm, her voice steady as she reiterated that internal access correlation did not establish intent, and that complex enterprise systems frequently produced misleading linkages when multiple administrative layers interacted under high-load conditions. But even as she spoke, her tone carried a subtle shift that suggested she understood the narrowing space of explanation. Maya Johnson stood slightly behind the table now, her attention no longer on the screen but on Ethan, as if the next decision mattered more than the entire chain of technical evidence that had been constructed in front of them. Ethan finally turned away from the display and asked Dr. Reed to isolate the exact device identifier linked to the legacy authorization event, and Dr. Reed complied, bringing up a terminal trace that revealed a single administrative console associated with the override sequence. Its identifier partially masked but still consistent with a secure executive workstation located within the upper-level administrative wing of the building. The room seemed to tighten further as the location data stabilized on screen, because it was not an abstract network node anymore, but a physical point inside the same facility where they were currently standing. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her eyes tracked the data more slowly now, and she stated that executive workstations were shared environments with rotating access permissions, emphasizing that proximity to a device did not equate to operational responsibility. Ethan listened without interruption, then asked a second question, asking whether the system recorded biometric authentication during the override session, and Dr. Reed confirmed that the log indicated a verified biometric match at the time of access, including fingerprint and facial recognition confirmation tied to the executive profile associated with that workstation. A heavier silence followed this confirmation, because biometric authentication removed several remaining layers of technical ambiguity, and Maya quietly stepped closer again, pointing to the authentication timestamp, noting that it aligned precisely with the window during which the DNA report had been modified and later validated. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice still controlled but less fluid, stating that biometric systems, while advanced, were not infallible, and that spoofing or replication under controlled conditions had been documented in isolated security research scenarios, though she did not provide any direct claim that such an event had occurred here. Ethan slowly lowered his gaze to the table, placing one hand on the edge as if grounding himself in the physical environment while the digital reconstruction continued to display its layered sequence of events. Dr. Reed then added cautiously that the system had also recorded a secondary confirmation input following the biometric authentication, a final approval action that sealed the modification into the official record, and that this action had been executed from the same administrative environment within a very short interval, suggesting continuity of presence rather than separate interventions. Maya observed this detail closely and stated that the consistency of timing across all recorded events reduced the probability of accidental overlap to an extremely low margin, framing the sequence as a structured chain rather than disconnected anomalies. Ethan finally asked for the system to display the full session reconstruction from initiation to final validation, and the screen shifted again, expanding into a continuous timeline that showed access initiation, data retrieval, modification execution, biometric verification, and final approval, all contained within a tightly compressed time span that now formed a coherent operational pattern. Victoria stepped slightly away from the table, turning her head toward the glass wall as if considering the implications externally rather than internally, and she stated that even if the system sequence appeared continuous, it still did not explain motive or intent, and that interpretation of technical sequences should not be confused with behavioral certainty. Ethan did not respond immediately because his focus had narrowed to a single point on the timeline where the modification and validation intersected almost seamlessly, and he asked Dr. Reed if there was any record of parallel access attempts from alternative devices during the same window. Dr. Reed ran an additional query and confirmed that no parallel intrusion attempts had been logged, which meant the system activity was isolated within a single authenticated session rather than distributed across multiple actors. Maya remained quiet for a moment, then said softly that isolation of access reduced the likelihood of external interference and increased the probability that the event originated from within authorized control boundaries, a statement that hung in the air without needing further elaboration. Ethan finally straightened, stepping slightly back from the table as if creating distance between himself and the data, and he looked once more at Victoria, not with accusation, but with a shifting form of recognition shaped by accumulated confirmation rather than assumption. Victoria met his gaze without speaking, her expression controlled but no longer neutral in the same way it had been at the beginning of the sequence, while Dr. Reed stood between them and the screen dimmed slightly as the system completed its final reconstruction cycle, leaving the room in a state where the evidence was no longer fragmented but fully aligned. And the only remaining uncertainty was no longer about what the system had done, but about how the people in the room would choose to interpret what the system had already revealed. The final reconstruction sequence remained displayed on the central screen inside Carter Genetics' boardroom, but the energy in the room had shifted from investigation into something far more delicate, as if every piece of data now carried not just technical meaning but personal consequence. While Ethan Carter stood still with his gaze fixed on the timeline that had been fully assembled, showing a continuous chain of access, modification, biometric authentication, and final validation, all compressed into a single coherent sequence that no longer appeared fragmented or accidental in any meaningful way. Dr. Allen Reed slowly lowered his tablet, no longer actively running queries, as if the system itself had reached the limit of what it could reveal without human interpretation taking over, while Maya Johnson remained quietly near the side of the table, her posture unchanged but her attention fully present, watching Ethan not for reaction but for resolution, as though the next decision would define the meaning of everything that had just been uncovered. Victoria Carter stood a few feet away from the table, her arms now resting loosely at her sides, her expression composed in a way that no longer felt purely defensive, but instead carefully measured, as if she was weighing not just the evidence but the direction of perception forming around it. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but lower than before, asking Dr. Reed to confirm one more time whether any system-level error could replicate the exact combination of biometric authentication, legacy override routing, and sequential validation observed in the reconstructed log, and Dr. Reed hesitated before responding that while isolated anomalies could occur in complex systems, the probability of all recorded elements aligning in a single uninterrupted session without intentional coordination was statistically extremely low under standard operational models. That statement hung in the room without further elaboration, and Maya quietly added that she had cross-checked the audit structure against external compliance frameworks, noting that the sequence did not match any recognized error correction pattern, but instead resembled a deliberate procedural flow executed with full system awareness. Ethan absorbed this without interruption, then slowly turned toward Victoria and asked her a direct question, not framed as accusation but as clarification, asking whether she had any involvement in accessing or reviewing the DNA report during the time window identified in the reconstruction. Victoria met his gaze without hesitation, and after a brief pause she answered that she had not personally initiated any modification to the report, reiterating that her role in the system was oversight rather than execution, and that any access logs associated with her profile would reflect standard executive visibility rather than operational alteration. The room remained still as she spoke, with only the faint hum of the building infrastructure audible through the glass walls, while Ethan continued to study her expression carefully, not reacting outwardly, but processing the consistency between her statement and the system data displayed behind him. Dr. Reed cleared his throat slightly and added that the system log showed a complete session trace from initiation to final approval, and that the continuity of authentication indicators suggested a single uninterrupted user presence rather than multiple sequential operators, a detail that subtly tightened the atmosphere again as it reduced the range of plausible interpretations. Maya stepped forward slightly, pointing again to the segment of the timeline where the modification and validation occurred within seconds of each other, and she explained that such rapid sequencing typically requires either pre-configured automation or immediate manual approval following direct access, both of which would require full awareness of system behavior at an administrative level. Victoria responded calmly that awareness of system design was part of her executive responsibility, and that familiarity with protocols did not equate to execution of specific actions within them, maintaining her position with controlled precision. Ethan nodded slowly, then asked Dr. Reed to isolate the moment of biometric confirmation once more, and the screen zoomed into the authentication layer where facial recognition and fingerprint validation had been logged, time-stamped, and synchronized with the modification event. He studied it in silence for several seconds before asking whether biometric systems could be triggered through remote session mirroring or duplicated authentication channels under internal network conditions, and Dr. Reed replied that while theoretical vulnerabilities existed in cybersecurity research, there was no recorded evidence within their system of such an occurrence during the time frame in question. Maya remained silent during this exchange, but her presence continued to anchor the room's focus, as she was no longer introducing new evidence, but reinforcing the structure of what had already been revealed. Ethan finally stepped slightly away from the table, creating distance between himself and the display, and looked once again between Victoria and the reconstructed data, as if trying to reconcile procedural certainty with relational context. While Victoria held her position steady, her expression now less reactive and more contained, as though waiting for the interpretation phase to resolve itself externally. Dr. Reed quietly stated that the audit sequence was now fully complete, and that all available system layers had been reconstructed to the highest level of detail permitted under corporate security protocol, which effectively marked the end of technical analysis and the beginning of executive interpretation. The screen dimmed slightly as the active data stream paused, leaving only the final timeline visible. And in that moment, Ethan understood that nothing further would be revealed by the system itself, because every remaining conclusion would depend not on additional data, but on how the existing sequence was understood. And as he stood in the center of that realization, surrounded by silence, observation, and unresolved implication, the room itself seemed to wait for the first decision that would define what came next. The final audit sequence remained frozen on the central display, but the meaning of it had begun to shift inside the Carter Genetics boardroom, as Ethan Carter stood motionless near the glass table with his attention no longer moving between data points, but settling into a single sustained focus, while Dr. Alan Reed quietly stepped back from the terminal, signaling that the technical phase of analysis had reached its endpoint, and Maya Johnson remained in place near the side chair, her presence still and steady, watching Ethan with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the beginning of the investigation. Victoria Carter stood near the opposite side of the room, her posture composed, her gaze occasionally moving toward the screen but returning to Ethan with careful restraint, as if she understood that what came next would no longer be determined by the system logs, but by interpretation and decision. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, asking Dr. Reed to summarize the full chain of events in plain operational terms without technical abstraction, and Dr. Reed hesitated briefly before stating that the system showed a single authenticated session originating from an executive access point, using verified biometric credentials that executed a modification to the DNA report, followed immediately by a validation approval that finalized the altered data as official record. The simplicity of that summary contrasted sharply with the complexity of the reconstruction, and the room seemed to tighten again as the implication became unavoidable in its clarity. Victoria responded first, stating that even a single authenticated session could still be subject to misinterpretation if credentials were used without explicit intent, emphasizing that access control systems were designed to validate identity, not to interpret motive, and therefore the presence of authentication should not be conflated with purpose. Ethan listened without interrupting, then asked a second question, asking whether any part of the system record indicated external compromise or unauthorized intrusion during the sequence, and Dr. Reed confirmed that no external breach indicators had been detected, and that all activity originated within secured internal infrastructure under valid authentication layers. Maya quietly added that she had reviewed the temporal alignment of all events, and that the compression of actions into a single continuous window reduced the likelihood of incidental system behavior, reinforcing the conclusion that the sequence was operationally deliberate rather than accidental. A long silence followed, during which the only movement in the room came from the subtle shift of light across the glass walls, while Ethan remained still, absorbing not only the data but the narrowing scope of interpretation it allowed. Victoria stepped slightly closer to the table again and stated that she understood the need for accountability in corporate systems, but cautioned that conclusions drawn without complete contextual review could lead to reputational harm and structural instability within the organization, particularly when sensitive family and corporate domains intersected. Ethan turned toward her slowly, his expression controlled but now fully attentive, and he asked if she was suggesting that the reconstructed system data itself was unreliable, to which she responded that she was suggesting only that interpretation required caution when outcomes carried personal consequence beyond technical scope. Dr. Reed interjected carefully, stating that from a purely systems perspective, the reconstruction represented a coherent and internally consistent sequence with no detected contradictions across logs, authentication layers, or validation pathways. Maya remained silent during this exchange, but her eyes stayed fixed on Ethan, as if waiting for the point where observation transitioned into acknowledgement. Ethan finally moved away from the table, walking a few steps toward the center of the room, creating distance between himself and both the data and the people around it. And he spoke in a measured tone, stating that regardless of interpretation, the system had produced a record that could not be ignored, and that the company could not proceed without addressing the integrity of its internal access protocols. Victoria replied that she agreed with strengthening protocols, but maintained that no conclusion should be drawn about individual responsibility without additional corroboration beyond system reconstruction alone, and her voice remained steady but increasingly precise in its phrasing. Ethan nodded slightly, then asked Dr. Reed if the system could generate a final integrity report confirming whether the DNA file in its current state matched the original submission prior to all recorded modifications, and Dr. Reed initiated the final verification sequence, causing the screen to update one last time. The display showed a direct comparison between the initial verified DNA report and the final validated version, highlighting differences in specific data fields that had been altered during the identified session, and confirming that the final version presented earlier was not identical to the original submission. The room fell completely silent at that confirmation, not because it was unexpected, but because it removed the remaining layer of ambiguity that had allowed alternative interpretations to persist. Ethan stared at the comparison for several seconds, then slowly turned his head toward Victoria. While she stood still, her expression controlled and unreadable in a way that no longer invited explanation, only observation. Maya did not move, but her presence felt more defined in the silence, as if her role in the sequence had already completed its purpose. Dr. Reed stepped back slightly from the terminal, lowering his hands, signaling that there were no further technical outputs available, and the screen stabilized on the final comparison state. Ethan remained standing in the center of the room, no longer engaging with the system but with the implications it had fully presented, and as the silence continued, it became clear that the investigation had reached its conclusion not through declaration, but through the exhaustion of all possible technical uncertainty, leaving only the question of how each person in the room would now define the truth they had collectively witnessed. The final confirmation of the DNA comparison remained displayed on the screen, but no one in the Carter Genetics boardroom was looking at it with the same purely analytical focus anymore, because the moment the system had fully aligned the original and modified versions of the report, the meaning of everything preceding it had shifted into a single unavoidable conclusion that now hung between the four people in the room. Ethan Carter stood still in the center of the space, his eyes fixed not on the display anymore, but on the reality it represented, while Dr. Alan Reed remained near the terminal with his hands lowered, no longer initiating any further queries, as if the system itself had closed its investigative cycle. Maya Johnson quietly took a small step back, returning closer to her original position near the chair, her posture calm and steady, her role in the sequence now complete, but still present in the silence that followed. Victoria Carter stood facing the table, her expression composed in a way that no longer carried explanation, only containment, as though every possible interpretation had already been reduced to what could no longer be undone. Ethan finally spoke, his voice measured and low, asking Dr. Reed to confirm once more whether any ambiguity remained in the integrity comparison, and Dr. Reed answered carefully that the system had completed a full structural verification cycle and that the discrepancies identified between the original and final report were confirmed across all redundant audit layers, leaving no unresolved technical contradictions within the reconstruction. That statement settled into the room without resistance, because there was nothing left in the system that could revise or reinterpret it. Victoria then spoke, her tone controlled and deliberate, stating that even with confirmed discrepancies, procedural review required separation between system outcome and assumed intent, emphasizing that corporate governance frameworks were designed to evaluate data integrity independently from personal inference. Ethan listened without interruption, then slowly turned his attention toward her, not with immediate reaction, but with a measured stillness that suggested he was no longer processing data, but re-evaluating everything built around it. Maya remained silent, her gaze moving briefly between Ethan and the display, as if confirming that the sequence she had initiated by presenting the first inconsistency had now reached its final structural state. Dr. Reed cleared his throat softly and stated that from a systems perspective, all available logs, authentication layers, and validation sequences had been fully exhausted in the audit, meaning no further technical escalation pathways remained within the current infrastructure. The room felt smaller after that statement, not physically, but in scope, as though the boundaries of explanation had closed around the remaining participants. Ethan took a slow step toward the table, placing one hand lightly on its surface, and asked Victoria directly whether she disputed the authenticity of the reconstructed system timeline, and there was a pause before she replied that she did not dispute the existence of the logs, but questioned the interpretation being placed upon them in absence of additional contextual variables. Ethan nodded slightly, then asked Dr. Reed if any external review authority could independently validate the reconstruction without relying on internal system interpretation, and Dr. Reed confirmed that an external forensic audit could be initiated, but would require formal escalation and would extend beyond internal governance control. Maya quietly added that the reconstructed sequence already contained all operational variables necessary for independent verification, and that delaying external validation would not change the underlying structure of what had already been recorded. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at the screen one final time, where the original and modified DNA reports remained aligned side by side, their differences highlighted in precise detail, representing not interpretation but recorded alteration. Victoria remained still, her gaze steady but no longer offering additional explanation, while Dr. Reed stood quietly beside the terminal, his presence now purely observational. Ethan finally straightened and spoke in a calm but definitive tone, stating that the findings of the internal audit would be escalated for independent review immediately, and that all access privileges related to the DNA report system would remain suspended until external verification was completed. There was no reaction that followed his statement beyond subtle shifts in posture, because the decision itself marked the transition from investigation to consequence management. Maya lowered her gaze slightly, not in retreat but in completion, as though the purpose of her presence had been fully realized within the sequence of events that had unfolded. Victoria finally turned away from the table, walking a few steps toward the window again, her silhouette framed against the glass as she remained silent, no longer participating in the interpretation of the data, but standing outside its immediate procedural scope. Dr. Reed powered down the active display, leaving only ambient light in the room, and the reconstructed timeline disappeared from view, though its implications remained fully present in the space it had occupied. Ethan remained in the center of the room for several seconds without speaking, then slowly stepped back from the table, his attention no longer on the system or the people around him, but on the irreversible clarity that had emerged from it. As the investigation formally transitioned into its final phase, where the truth was no longer being discovered, but being processed through consequences that had already begun to take shape.